Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. We'll just give a couple, another minute or two, give some people some time to join in. Yeah, we'll just get going. Thanks for joining us, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Brian Marcuscio. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Sequentur. Welcome to today's webinar on a topic that is at the forefront of modern IT solutions, and that's the Active Directory migration to Azure AD Cloud. We're happy to have so many of you guys joining us today. Eager to delve into the crucial aspect of this digital transformation. Throughout this session, we'll explore the seamless transition from on-premises Active Directory to the dynamic Azure Active environment. Our experts, Roman, our CEO, and Chris, our CISO, will be navigating through the best practices, strategies, and insights to ensure a smooth migration experience. Throughout this session, we want to emphasize that we want your participation as much as possible. We don't want this just to be another presentation. We want it to be a conversation. So we encourage you to make this session as interactive as possible. Feel free to voice any questions as we progress through the presentation. Just unmute yourself at any time or use a chat feature and submit your comments or questions or even experiences that relate to the topics we're covering. Roman and Chris are here not only to share the insights and our experiences as a company going through this process, but to address your specific concerns and queries. And then just a quick reminder that today's webinar will be recorded, so you can revisit any details or share the insights with your teams. And at this moment, let's jump in. I throw it over to Chris and Roman. And again, if you have any questions at any time, please don't hesitate to speak up or throw a question in the chat room, and we'll get to it as soon as we can.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So before we get started, I just want to orient our guests to what we're talking about. Active Directory is the database that lives on the servers known as domain controllers in your network, and they contain usernames, passwords, and groups these users belong to that provides authentication. It's been with us in some way, shape, or form since even before year 2000. It was not called Active Directory back then, but in 2000, Microsoft rolled out Active Directory. I do remember this vividly. But what Microsoft Azure AD is basically the same thing, except you authenticate to the cloud. Microsoft hosts the servers. So this is essentially the same thing, except Microsoft has the servers, and you have the same usernames and passwords. The idea of having it in the cloud is not new. It's been with us since Office 365 came out in 2014, I believe. What's new about this is complete decommissioning your on-premise Active Directory infrastructure. Basically, no more domain controllers, they're all gone bye-bye, and be managing your entire IT infrastructure out of the cloud. We have done several clients to date, a number of clients. We're actually doing one process. We just complete our own, start to finish. So we're going to be able to speak about that. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the virtual microphone to Chris Capps, who's going to start the presentation. If you guys have any questions, if you feel like you don't understand my accent, something got bogged down, please stop me, and we will stop me or Chris, and we will explain it again. Chris.
Thank you, Roman. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Give me 1 second to share my screen, and we will go ahead and get started. All right. Let me know if you cannot see it. All right. As Roman mentioned, we are here to talk about the migration from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. As Roman mentioned, it is essentially the same system, just ported to the cloud. There are some nuances, there are some differences, but functionally it's the same system. The first thing you want to do when considering an assessment to a migration to the cloud is a pre-migration assessment. Conducting a pre-migration assessment is important for a variety of reasons. The first question you want to ask yourself is, what systems does my Active Directory integrate with? This is probably the biggest question, because this question will determine essentially whether or not you can migrate to the cloud. When you have a lot of systems integrated into Active Directory, you tend to run into accounting software, client relationship management software, ERP systems, and sometimes those systems do not play well inside the cloud. Either the vendors are resistant to a cloud or the cost to upgrade the software to be able to move to the cloud is a blocker. So that's probably the first question that you want to consider when considering a migration. Can you actually do it? What systems does my Active Directory integrate with? The next thing you want to consider is what applications you have configured for single sign-on via Active Directory. This is important because once you have moved away from Active Directory, those will no longer work. Typically, it only takes a few minutes to run through and migrate the single sign-on to Azure. In some cases, you get into some attribute mapping scenarios, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. After that, you want to ask, do I have any systems that absolutely will not migrate to the cloud? So we've identified everything that's integrated to Active Directory. We've identified everything that is single sign-on to Active Directory. What out of those items will not go to the cloud? And if you have anything that will not go to the cloud at that point that absolutely relies on Active Directory, you may not be able to migrate. The good news is if you have methods of authentication that are outside of Active Directory on those systems, you still might have workarounds. Before you start the migration, you want to ask if you have backdoor access to everything in case something goes awry. Just in case something goes crazy during the process, you want to make sure that you have a secondary or even a tertiary account in some cases to make sure you can get into various systems. Prior to conducting the migration, you want to ask yourself if you have the proper licensing in Office 365. This is going to provide the same security and functionality that you're expecting, and make sure that you're compliant with Microsoft licensing. And finally, will you be using Intune to manage your machines after the fact? Our traditional way to manage machines in the Active Directory environment are called group policy objects, or GPOs. These generally control the settings associated with given accounts, groups, devices, etc. For the most part, GPOs will translate into Intune configurations. Intune itself even has a GPO analysis tool that allows you to identify what can and cannot be mapped. Pretty much every setting that exists within the Windows system exists within the settings catalog in Intune. So there's probably a way you can do it even if it doesn't map directly. As Brian mentioned, we like this to be a conversation. So if you all have any questions or comments on pre-migration assessment, I'll go ahead and open it up for a moment.
So, Chris, one of the questions customers commonly ask at this point is early in a preparation stage. If I have servers that are currently joined to the domain and workstations, should they be joined to Azure Active Directory? Can it be done, and what are the limitations? Yeah, absolutely. So you can and should still move your machines to Azure Active Directory into an Azure AD joined status. This is kind of the ultimate ownership, if you will, of the machine. You can also enroll these machines into Intune. They should be moved. Anything that you have that exists on the Active Directory infrastructure should be moved, simply because once Active Directory is gone, that authentication mechanism is gone. So you want to make sure, and back to the bullet about the backdoor access, you want to make sure that you can get in even when Active Directory is turned off. Excellent. Regarding licensing, can you provide a brief overview? I know this is probably a much larger discussion. Microsoft licensing that is. Is it like P1? What would be the license types required to ensure that machines can join Azure AD and can be managed from there, including Intune?
Yeah, absolutely. So 100%, we could do multiple webinars just on Microsoft licensing. So basic structure, you want to have the licensing for Azure Active Directory controls. This is typically going to start at Azure AD P1. That allows you, the directory controls themselves. It allows you to join machines to the directory, but it also allows you to utilize conditional access policies. There are a variety of plans that allow Intune access. You can get it on a standalone basis for a machine, but you can also bundle it into your licensing that exists within 365. A lot of the base licensing includes it. Business Premium tends to be our recommendation just because it includes the best array of features for the cost.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions, or can we proceed? Aaron?
So with the question number 3 there, do I have any systems that will not migrate to the cloud? When you say migrate to the cloud, are you talking about it at least migrate to an Azure environment, or does it need to be a software as a service kind of a migration? Or are you talking about servers that are physical boxes that have to stay on premises?
Excellent question. So essentially all of the above, right? The best example I have of this is legacy accounting software. There are many times that we've run across clients that have an accounting software for one reason or another has to exist on premise inside of Active Directory. Either that's because the vendor themselves don't really want to support a cloud existence, or the client, there's a cost barrier there for the client to get the upgrade that requires the cloud existence. If you have hardware servers, you can still support those in Azure Active Directory, and you can essentially virtualize those if you'd like. There comes a point where you can't virtualize items. Best example I have of that is some proprietary systems where you have hardware key licenses just to run the software. In many cases, those types of machines can't be ported, if you will, into Azure.
For example, Sage is the usual offender that we see that cannot be ported over, or some older versions of Citrix. Obviously,
Right.
anything except for the latest one will not work.
As a follow-up, so I think we're in a situation where we're enough in Azure that it wouldn't really affect us. But what if somebody does have an application that cannot be moved to the cloud? Is that into the conversation, or are there ways to work around to have some kind of exception for that configuration and use Azure AD for everything else?
There's almost always a workaround. I guess the best example I have of no workaround is the one I just gave, where you have a proprietary system that requires a hardware key for licensing for the software to run. I see this a lot in manufacturing environments. If in that case, you're essentially just stuck unless the vendor is going to allow you to virtualize it. But in most cases, you can still hook your hardware machines into Azure and provide access. It just will no longer be through Active Directory. So I think the point here is if the system relies on Active Directory specifically for authentication and function, you'll be at a loss.
Excellent. I mean, to add to this, some clients that we have, they have legacy systems that they isolate in island mode, either on-premise in our own virtual platform on Azure. They can turn it on, for example, as this development system or accounting system on demand, and we keep one or two domain controllers, separately for that purpose only. Considering IRS requires us keep tax records for 7 years, I mean, that may be some time before you can decommission it. See, the whole point of, maybe I'm wrong, but it just seems to me the whole point of why customers wants to move to cloud and get away from on-premise is security. Basically, it's much safer than Microsoft because, Microsoft Azure 365 have not had any major breaches. Hopefully they won't. They have significant investment in security. And needless to say, if something happens with Microsoft, we as the, customers cannot really be blamed by going to the biggest and not the really monopolistic provider, right? So in this specific situation, you still significantly improve your organizational footprint, operational footprint, And, by moving it to Azure AD completely, well, if you have like 1 or 2 domain controllers on isolated environment, for several legacy apps, only a handful of users do access on occasion, which has tight security controls around it. I think this is an acceptable solution. Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah, I posted it in the Q&A, but I'll go ahead and ask it. We have our servers virtualized, but they're virtualized on-prem. We have hundreds of terabytes of data and storage systems that are on-prem. We are not looking to migrate that server or that storage to the cloud. So in that scenario, would we want to get rid of our on-prem domain controllers? I mean, we already have the Azure AD configured in our on-prem sync with the Azure AD domain controller. But in our situation, how would it benefit us to say, okay, we're going to get rid of all on-prem domain controllers and only have the one hosted in Azure AD? Or are we best to have at least one domain controller on each of our sites?
So,
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so this conversation is actually about getting rid of all of your domain controllers in Active Directory entirely. So you can still have servers and systems and infrastructure set up on-premise or hosted in Azure, however you like it. Specifically, we're talking about moving away from Active Directory and using Azure Active Directory for management of users and devices.
Right. So yes, it is possible, Scott, to connect your service, to join your service to Azure AD and operate. Basically, that's authenticate to Azure domain controllers, not on-premise ones. And the beauty of the solution is a single pane of glass for reporting, alerting, policies, etc. As you know, Active Directory on-premise can be very clunky when it comes to reports, audits, like find out who are the users didn't log in. Can be automatically disabled? Not really, not easily, not consistently. And Azure AD 100%. You guys seen it, how it works in Office 365 with two-factor, passwords and conditional access policies. So yeah, you can still have on-premise server to answer the questions, join to Azure AD, and still have a benefit of full Azure Active Directory.
So at a very high level, we would disjoin them from the domain and then register them in Azure Active Directory?
Yes, sir.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions? Can we proceed further? Chris, let's proceed. John Spencer has a question. My apologies, John.
Yeah, so I was wondering similarly, like, what about things like a Synology NAS, and also if there's like service accounts to like the firewall, can all that stuff be converted from on-prem, like security elements to Azure security or accounts that manage those components?
So that's going to depend on the given technology itself. So like you mentioned Synology, if Synology has it in their infrastructure to allow you to authenticate with Azure, then absolutely. Sometimes you have to do so via API, but oftentimes you can do so within the UI itself, the user interface. But that's going to be on a system by system basis. Essentially, I think the key to take away here is that if they are using Active Directory services for authentication, they need to be considered, for a reconfiguration, essentially.
Right. The newer devices most often will have such capability, or updated firmware will. Legacy probably won't. So it goes on device by device, technology by technology. There's some caveats regarding certificate-based authentication. Chris is going to go in the future. But I mean, it basically brings to the forefront the necessity to have an assessment. This way, you know exactly what you're getting yourself into, because maybe like this is not for everyone. It may be still another year or two if your organization is mature enough IT-wise to be able to do this migration.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so essentially, recapping the considerations that we have found from the pre-migration assessment. So is this even feasible for my environment? And we've had plenty of great conversation on that. I think ultimately, does the system that you're considering integrate with Active Directory, and can it be integrated with Azure Active Directory? That's the basic question. What are my existing integrations, right? So what do I have that's currently tied into Active Directory that I can move? A lot of times this is going to be a single sign-on. Single sign-on can be configured on the Active Directory side, but it also can be configured cloud side, and the transition between those is pretty easy. And then after that, what needs to be handled now versus after the migration? So the best example of now is single sign-on applications for critical functions. So my accounting team needs to sign into this accounting application, and they do it through Active Directory credentials right now. I need to make sure that they are good to go before we start migrating them. That way they can still function afterwards. And then what are the potential roadblocks? And again, this kind of ties into that first bullet point. What is it that is going to stop me? What is it that is going to throw hiccups? And the biggest things are legacy systems, super complicated environments where maybe you don't know 100% where that Active Directory account is used, and it goes to be migrated, and all of a sudden the system stops working.
So one of the things that the customers typically ask us about, and they don't really consider, the user onboarding and onboarding process will change, obviously, because you have a new way of provisioning user accounts, new way of setting up security, new way of deploying new computers through Intune or Autopilot. So all these things are best taken care of before time with testing, because this is not, honestly, a very easy lift. And this is a big systemic change despite an apparent ease of how it should be done. So our recommendation, what we found the hard way, don't go into this after you're done. Plan it ahead of time. Test, document, and train your IT staff as priority one, and make sure users are trained before you go into migration. Chris, back over to you, unless anybody have any questions regarding the slide.
Awesome. One of the things that I was going to add here is one of the bigger hurdles, not necessarily roadblock. One of the bigger hurdles we see is when an environment uses certificate-based authentication. Because Azure Active Directory doesn't handle standard Windows authentication like NTLM and Kerberos, it also doesn't handle the certificate-based authentication to get onto networks, Wi-Fi, et cetera, inside of your environment. So if you have these in your environment, it's also something to be considered. As I mentioned, not necessarily a roadblock, as there are a number of authentication avenues that Azure AD provides. Just something to keep at top of mind.
Right.
All right. So we've run through the assessment. We've got all the critical considerations out of the way. We've decided we're going to migrate. Let's prepare. So the first thing you want to do is to prepare your cloud environment for the desired state. This includes security controls, right? So things like conditional access policy. Maybe you want to build out an Intune security baseline. Any kind of management that you want to have in your environment. This is a good time to discuss how you're going to control items via groups. We often see 365 and Azure environments built out in such a way that removing a user from a group or two provides the functionality to provision, deprovision applications, deprovision resources. Similarly, adding users to groups, you can use those to control your application provisioning as well. So it makes management of users really easy. It's very similar in Active Directory. However, it's much more push button. That's the best way I can put it. So you want to make sure you have the cloud environment prepped for the desired ending state before you start moving your objects over. Then you want to prepare the on-premise environment for desynchronization. So typically this is going to involve building an organizational unit inside of Active Directory, so just a bucket that I can tell the system to not sync to 365. And you can use that bucket to put a single user, groups of users, all the users, and push the sync button and facilitate essentially a decommission in 365. and migrates the user to a cloud. After you're prepped for the migration on the on-premises side, you want to prepare your support team for the coming change. So anybody that is going to support these users and these systems needs to know that what you're doing, right? Hey, everybody, we're moving from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. Everything should go through here. This is your process. These are your steps. This is what you should expect. And likewise, do that for your users. Right, go through and prep the users. Hey, we're making this transition. It's going to be a little different, but it's going to be a lot of the same. So let's just all work together and make it as seamless as possible. And finally, you need to prepare the items that need to be handled prior to the migration so that they function once the user have been migrated. So as we discussed, that accounting application that my accounting team needs to be functional. We have to make sure that they have access to do that before we start migrating them. That way they're not down. The best way to do that is to go ahead and build a test account similar to how you would any normal user, and then work on migrating them over and testing access as needed. I'm going to go ahead and stop for a second, open it up there.
All right, so it is possible. I mean, we're doing this migration is done one user at a time. So you can, once you have it done, you basically move one user at a time, and if you allows your support team to address any issues user may be having, without overwhelming them and or having a massive outage should any bad things occur. Also, to add to what Chris had said, a lot of times you go client to client, Azure environment, not ready. It's Azure security score low, two-factor not done for everything. Basically, typical Microsoft recommendation, run of the mill, are not being done. There's no reason, first of all, they shouldn't be done. They should always be done. And second of all, you don't want to get this environment in the cloud as clean and as perfect as possible before you guys start, because moving stuff will break it. You'll make it messy. It's like moving it to your home. It's going to get messy. But if it's messy from the beginning, it is going to be terrible. So this is definitely a lesson learned that you really have to have all your ducks in a row before you start. Does anybody have any questions? John?
Yeah, so are you saying that moving users over one at a time is not recommended, or I didn't quite understand?
It is recommended. It is recommended. This is how, it's possible to do them all at the same time. You can do them all. But this scenario is recommended to do one user or one group at a time for a bigger organization. Sequential, so, Chris, we did like what, 3-4 a day or something like this.
Yeah, that's right. And I was actually going to cover this a little bit in the next slide, but we can get into it here. So essentially, it depends on your environment, right? If you have the tolerance to be able to tell all of your users, hey, at this date, we're doing this, you're going to get new credentials. You need to go here and make sure you can sign in and access everything. And if they can handle that, then you absolutely can flip a switch and do it all at once. We found, because we had so many moving parts, I mean, we had Active Directory, Okta, Intune, Citrix, just a host of moving parts inside the organization, that we found that it was best to just handle them on an individual basis, make sure everybody was good to go. And it really, the time was probably about the same. I would, if we had flipped the switch and everything broke, we would have spent far more hours trying to get migrated.
Right. Okay, John?
So in terms of the one-on-ones, is there a way around not having them to change their password or anything, or that's the drawback to the one-on-one solution?
Excellent question. That is going to depend on the state of your Active Directory environment. And I'm going to mix terminologies here, so I'm not even going to use them. But essentially, if your environment is federated and they move over, you essentially have to reset their user's password, so they're going to get new credentials. It is possible. Microsoft has an authentication method, and I think it's called password hash sync, where you can get into a situation to where you don't actually have to reset anybody's credentials because the credential already lives inside of 365. So that really is going to depend on your environment.
Chris, can you explain federated?
Absolutely. So in most Active Directory environments, not all, but most, you have what is called a federated domain. And if you think about Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, you've got a link between the two that allows them to work together. But Active Directory is the main source of truth, if you will, right? And so when that's the case, you can't manage your users inside of 365 on the federated domain. So you can't change their username. You can do some basic email and configuration stuff, but like the basic management of the user, all of that is done inside of Active Directory. So in order to eliminate that control, you have to do what is called defederate, right? And that relinquishes the control of that domain back over to the cloud and, in essence, Microsoft and Azure.
All right. Does anybody have any other questions? All right, let's continue, Chris.
All right. So process. So once the environment has been prepped, it is time to ensure the process is valid with a test user and begin migration. So as I mentioned, you build out a user just like you would any normal user, and walk through the migration step by step, documenting as you go, identifying any hiccups, any issues, etc. Depending on your method and level of integration, the process can be all at once, as we discussed, or on a per user basis. The larger and more complicated your environment, the more I would tend to recommend on a per user or per group basis. That way you can make sure your users are still functional, make sure you don't have any big issues, make sure you don't have any widespread outages. Because we had several moving parts to consider, including the existence of Okta, we found it best to handle each user individually. The average time per user for migration was about 40 minutes. Some was less, some was more. Some of my users, I just told them, hey, here's your new credentials, you're migrated, and they handled everything. And some of my users, we had to work through some issues. So, probably about 40 minutes is a good average for, the 50 people that we did. And, given proper instruction, as I mentioned, if your users have the tolerance for it, this could very well be accomplished during after hours.
All right. My mailbox was, I think, 50 gigs or something. It took longer. I think it took a couple hours, but yeah, 40 minutes is about average. Does anybody have any questions?
Awesome.
All right, let's continue.
Yep. All right, so we've migrated everybody over. Now it's time to clean up the environment. We mentioned federation. What we needed to go ahead and do is defederate. And what this is going to allow to happen is it's going to allow Azure to manage the settings and objects associated with the federated domain. It severs the connection between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory and will allow full control of the objects from within the cloud portal. And then once defederation is complete, everything is functional. We've got no issues. We want to go ahead and make sure we pull a backup of whatever servers that we're planning to decommission. So in our case, a handful of domain controllers, and go ahead and shut them off. And that's, at a very high level, once you're done with Active Directory and you've made sure that your systems are functional and your users are functional and all of your integrations are functional, that's essentially all there is to it. Make sure that there's no federation. That way you can control your domain and turn off the resources you no longer need.
Chris, I'm sure some people are going to ask, well, say you move the users, how do you handle service accounts?
How do you handle service accounts? Yeah. So a lot of times in Azure, you're still going to be able to use an Azure user for a service account if absolutely necessary. Generally speaking, you're going to want to manage those, locally on the machine if they're no longer Active Directory machines, which they shouldn't be at this point. But often you can hook into either application integrations within Azure or just API hooks itself to get those accounts up and running without having to manage those accounts in Active Directory. So if you have any service accounts inside of Azure Active Directory, if you have any service accounts inside of Active Directory, you want to make sure you've addressed those prior to decommission.
Thank you. Any other questions? Adam?
So do you have estimates of the elapsed time from start to finish of a moderate sized organization, 100 users, 3 existing domain controllers, 4 existing domain controllers? How much time are we looking at to go through the analysis process, the planning process, and then the execution of this?
Probably about a quarter, probably about 3 months all in.
I mean, it's possible to do it sooner, but I mean, if organization is relatively new, like recently founded company that has newer software, going to be a breeze, going to be probably 3 weeks start to finish. Most organizations we deal with been in business, for 20, 30 plus years, so they have all kinds of other technologies being updated and dragged through, the obstacles to the finish line. So once we do an assessment, or you do an assessment, we can see like, well, there is a, this and this system, you may have to have a custom solution. This is not going to work. And, some, as you guys know, not all users are created equal. Some require more hand-holding and some require more white glove treatment. So based on that, for example, organizations, HR and accounting teams would be, a lot more affected than others. Some organizations, marketing team would be affected. So executive team is definitely affected by it. So you do want to plan, but for the size, a quarter is about a correct estimation.
Okay, and that's fine. Just the idea of how long it'll take in general. The change management obviously is going to be the most complicated piece, especially if we're talking about having to get users to reset credentials. So if we got plenty of time to notify them and get them ready for it, that's ideal. If it was a 1 month process and we were just going to be springing it on people, that would be a bit of a concern. But 3 months doesn't scare me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and
questions? So, please go ahead.
I was just going to throw one of the other considerations there is, even if you get into a position where you do have to reset your users' credentials, once they're in the cloud, Azure has self-service password reset. So your users can go in there and essentially reset their own credentials. And you can plan for that ahead of time to make sure that they're registered for that.
Right. So we've got to disconnect an existing self-service system so that people aren't going to the wrong spot for that kind of a thing. But yeah, I get what you're saying.
All right. Any other questions? Ken?
Hi there. Sorry, I forgot I was muted. I just have a quick question. Given the change, obviously moving to the cloud, do you guys feel that this is actually a good time to maybe reassess your security posture? I guess the basis of my question would be, you're normally keeping all of your information within your LAN, I guess, and now we're now looking at the cloud, but we're also looking at a more hybrid workforce.
Yeah, great question. So I may be a bit biased, but I think you should always be reassessing your security posture. And absolutely, right? If you're going to make any kind of big move, maybe it's time to look at the whole picture and evaluate the whole picture instead of just, hey, I want to move from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. Maybe you take a step back and look at, what can I do to provide the work from anywhere, but still secure my devices? What can I do to secure the organization's data and still let my users, BYOD on the mobile? That's absolutely a great time to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Any other questions? All right, let's continue.
All right, post-migration process changes. So we've moved systems. Some of your processes are going to change. Essentially, any process associated with Active Directory will need to be evolved to be incorporated into Azure Active Directory or some kind of local process. User management becomes quite easy once everything is in the cloud. Device management, very similar. It's all right there, same pane of glass. The biggest notice that we've seen for ourselves and for clients is that on and offboarding becomes far more streamlined. There are less moving pieces involved, less systems to deal with. You know, if your Azure Active Directory is properly configured, you build a user, you put them in a couple of groups. Those couple of groups provision everything that you need, and they're up and running in minutes. The accounts additionally have less sprawl across systems, making the management of those accounts easier. So less accounts in less places gives you less points to audit, you know, when it comes to that access review time. The SSO configurations now take place in Azure. So instead of using SSO through Active Directory, they would now be through Azure Active Directory. Essentially no change from a user perspective. The only thing that really changes is where it's configured. And then if you were previously onboarding your machines and joining them to your domain inside of your network, they would now be joined to Azure Active Directory instead of Active Directory and potentially Intune.
Again, as I mentioned earlier, when we did a survey of our customers, like what is the biggest problem you guys facing? And answer was surprising. We think it's cybersecurity, business continuity, training. It's actually user onboarding and offboarding. Literally for every customer, this is like the biggest problem, you know, because it comes from HR. You need to start a new user, especially rapidly growing in today's economy. And, you know, it's like sometimes takes months to fully provision a user, and you want to have minutes. With moving to Azure AD and setting up Intune properly, everything, including setting up a new laptop, installing all of the software, getting all required access, takes hours. Literally, you can have a user set up in half a day, start to finish, versus including everything: computer setup, all software installed, fully patched, etc., all groups, all software deployed for the user, all authentication, including single sign-on across all HR systems, accounting systems, etc., expense device systems. And yeah, so it's definitely moving in the right direction to help IT directors, CIOs with that problem. Does anybody have any questions regarding this slide? Hi, Chris, please proceed.
All right. So here I've got a little table of pros and cons. You'll notice that there's only one con on the right-hand side that is going to be the non-existence of on-premise infrastructure. I sat and racked my brain for a long time. I can't really think of any other con. So if you have one, I'm happy to hear it, because I couldn't think of one. But that is essentially a con, right? If you're in a position to where you have a system that requires you to have Active Directory, you no longer have that Active Directory infrastructure on your home network and your office network. So that's the big consideration, right? Do I need Active Directory on my office network? Do I need Active Directory on my LAN, right? And the pros, at least for me, from a security perspective, far outweigh the cons. So you have better control of your accounts, less sprawl in the accounts, better auditing. The logs in 365 are immutable, and they can be retained for a variety of periods of time, depending on your licensing and your configuration. The non-existence of Active Directory presents less attack surface area. This is a big one for me, as Active Directory and domain controller specifically are one amongst the most targeted things in the IT world. You get the full breadth of Microsoft security features associated with your users and your devices, right? So every security feature that you have inside of your 365 and Azure environment that applies to users and devices, and thus your access and data, you know, you have a far more robust security set than traditional Active Directory environments. For me, one of the pros is no more on-premise infrastructure. There's a couple of reasons for this. one, we don't have to manage it anymore, right? We don't have to maintenance it. Yeah, you still have to manage and maintenance Azure Active Directory, but it's a bit easier. It's a bit, as I mentioned, a bit more push button. But more importantly, this is a large transferal of liability. When you are operating any system, and this extends far beyond Active Directory or Azure or anything, when you are operating any system and you are in complete control of it, you are 100% liable for it. Because we are essentially transferring that liability to Microsoft, there's a little bit less liability. And to be frank, they have far more resources to ensure that things don't go offline and don't go crazy and are secure. Microsoft invests billions of dollars in security every year, and I don't know of another organization that even could do that. And then troubleshooting efficiencies, right? When you have one system, troubleshooting becomes far easier because you don't have to go to system A and check this, and system B and check this, and system C and check this, and then finally it was none of those. It was something completely random. With things being in 365, you have complete control of the objects right there, and essentially all of the troubleshooting features that you could want and abilities that you could want.
Sometimes we ask the question, what happens if internet goes down? Yes, your Azure AD is not going to work because the internet's down, but if the internet's down, nothing else really will work. Into 8 days and H plus, yeah, when was last time internet was down for a long time? So I don't think this is a question to ask. Any questions regarding this slide? Adam?
Roman, you should know I'm going to have a question after every slide. So from a security perspective, Azure AD is a service in and of itself within Microsoft, correct? So we have a few servers that we have migrated out to the Azure cloud, but going this route, we won't be maintaining our own Active Directory server inside of the Azure cloud. This is a totally separate thing that Microsoft is ultimately responsible for.
That's right.
Correct.
It's the same when you go to your Office 365 and you see your users. That's Azure Active Directory. This is how you manage users. And you have Microsoft Intune. This is how you manage computers and policies. For example, like group policy, every user get this printer installed, every user get this drive mapped, every user have like pink background on their desktop. This is now done through Intune. It's also part of the Office 365 portal with a single pane of glass, and this is where these controls are implemented. There's no more service. You don't tell the service.
So we've got a number of different things hanging off of the domain controllers in our environment. Printers, for example, a few printers are installed and they're shared out to different people. That can be handled through other ways using Azure AD and other means of hosting those printers, correct?
Yeah, so you can actually utilize Microsoft Universal Print. It's a pretty good feature. It lets you onboard your Office printers into the system. You don't have to worry about managing drivers. Your users can actually find whatever printer is closest to them. So it's a pretty cool feature they have in there.
And then the last question, domain controllers are typically set up to service a particular geography, right? Our different locations have different domain controllers they synchronize across. Is there any kind of segmentation that we lose by going with Microsoft AD or Azure AD versus our own on-prem AD with, again, certain locations having certain domain controllers that are responsible for them?
Yeah, so you can absolutely keep it split if you want in kind of like a multi-cloud scenario. But if, let's say, you have those multiple controllers for the geographic locations, but all of those users exist in Active Directory right now, like Office 365, they're all in the same directory in Office 365. The way you would segregate them in Office 365 is by managing groups and locations, right? And then you would, when you onboarded a user, you would put them in a group associated with the location. That location gets application A and this configuration, and that's how that would be managed.
There's no specific limit to this separation by the site, Active Directory site and services, were done due to when it first started in 2000. Not many people had T1s, that was a luxury. So basically some people had dial-up. So this so-called site links was a big deal. So you mean sometimes you change password on one side and now it shows up on another side. Nowadays, everybody's got a fiber everywhere, or 5G. So the speed the speed aspect becomes negligible. All of security attributes and changes propagate immediately, and they live in a cloud. You only see is the back end of it. Everything happens in the cloud. There's nothing to be pushed to your physical network.
All right, so thank you for that. Honestly, I would move that no on-premise infrastructure out of cons and put it over under pros, because to me, the less stuff that I've got inside we got to manage, the better it's going to be.
Yeah, 100%. I left it there because some clients unfortunately have systems that just require Active Directory, and in that instance, it becomes a con.
Right.
Awesome, John.
Yeah, just could you go into a little bit more about the printing? And then the other thing is talking about how would that work for if you're in an office, what delivering print services to local printers in that office?
Yes, so Microsoft Universal Print is a service that can be configured for your office environment. It's essentially a cloud version of a print server. It doesn't make you, like, you're no longer required to manage drivers. Users are able to find, as I mentioned, printers that are close to them that are functional with ease. We absolutely can set up a call to discuss that and further. But that's essentially the gist of Microsoft Universal Print. They've designed that service to facilitate those that need a print server in their environment, but still want to operate in the cloud.
Thank you.
Chris, do you have any more slides, or is that it?
I got one more lesson learned.
Okay.
All right. And I'll just run through this. So lessons learned. So one of the biggest items, SSO. Make sure that you have your single sign-on applications configured prior to migration. Attribute mapping may be required to make sure that the sign-on is working. What I mean by that is inside of the application configuration, you determine what attributes go where, and those sometimes need to be tinkered with. Auto provisioning. Often some of the third-party applications that you have are going to have auto provisioning enabled. What this allows users to do is create accounts on their own behalf. Sometimes during migration, this can cause account conflicts, so it's best to turn this off if possible. And then service accounts. So if you have any Active Directory accounts that were used as service accounts, it is best to move them to Azure or a local account and go ahead and re-authenticate as needed. And that completes the conversation about migration to Azure AD.
All right, now, do you guys have any questions left?
Well, thank you very much, Roman and Chris, for this delightful session here. Looks like advanced planning is going to be very crucial for this. I was wondering if you could take a quick minute to give some points about how to clean up our current Active Directory. And the second was, would you recommend or not to include the Intune piece as part of the Azure Active AD migration, or should we leave that separate? Thank you so much.
I'll take the first part about cleanup ID. Chris can add to it. You want to delete everything that's not used, right? Starting with, users, you do report. If you go to Active Directory, I know Chris, you can show it. Actually, we cannot show you. We don't have any more ID. If you open Active Directory users to computers, you click on the root, click on Find, and you click on Advanced. It gives you option like last login. You can basically show people who last logged in like 90 days by default, and it will show you people who logged in 90 plus days ago. If they didn't log in 90 days, there's no reason to keep those accounts. You can do the same thing for computer accounts, right? Next bigger items that becomes more painful is go through all of the Active Directory groups and prune them. That sometimes not easy. It seems something like 60,000 groups or something like this. This organization only had 60 users, but yeah, it happens. After this, simple things like organizational units. Some people have very complex and needed complexity, like containing a container. Business unit A, accounts payable by the first, on and on it goes, and empty, empty, empty. You want to streamline as much as possible, given when it goes to the cloud, this or you're not going to come across, but if they have content in them, like user accounts or groups and stuff, you probably want to move them in specific locations. This is for AD, service accounts, you do want to enumerate those. There's several scripts that we have, and we have some free scripts you can run, we can provide, that will basically crawl through your entire network and find service accounts that they're used, so you know what is being used, what is not being used. Regarding computers, regarding group policies, is not as easy. You guys all work probably with group policies, you know what pain that can be. And that gets moved to Intune, using the import tool. It's probably best to start from scratch. There's two commonly used group policies is default domain policy, default domain control policy that controls complexity of the password and length and things like that. And if all there is, and obviously Windows updates how often they're done, if they're done using GPO. If this is all there is to it, it's too easy. Sometimes you see like tens and sometimes hundreds of different group policy objects, or deploy this software, or don't reboot after the 5th. So you're going to, once you realize that these policies, even though may be misnamed or obsolete, still in use. Once you move away from your on-premise AD, they may disappear. That may cause hardship or unknown effects. So that's probably even a bigger job to go through all of them and like, is it being used? What is being affected? And biggest question, what if I delete it? What's going to happen now?
Right.
So yeah, that's what it is. Chris, do you have anything else to add?
No, I guess the only thing that I would add is that 100%, if you can get your Intune environment configured to where you want it before you start moving, that's going to make life easier in the long run, because it's easier to implement configurations at the outset instead of after the fact.
Interesting. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, sounds good. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Recording will be available. Obviously, if you're interested in this webinar, you're probably interested in moving your environment to Azure Active Directory. And this is probably a good start. Please let us know if we can assist you any further. We can do a free consultation and perhaps assist you with the move. Aaron?
So Roman, I appreciate the info. Definitely a lot of good stuff here. I wanted to ask what your backlog looks like these days, and if we decided we want to move forward, what your availability might be.
Well, knowing me, Chris, we could do it yesterday, but if you talk to our project manager, please don't schedule anything about 30 days out. So if you have it done, we can accommodate 30 days out easily.
All right, very good. Thank you guys all very much for the information. Definitely appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We will send out recording of the webinar, and we schedule additional webinars. Please let us know if you have any specific topics you would like us to cover. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.